end of the summer, and it's been a summer of going forth with this book, and it is incredibly fitting, and so it's so gratifying to be able to read in front of you, since a lot of the book was written here in my tiny little study and in our house in Truro, and in the snow and in the rain and in the summer. So to be able to bring the words forward into the air with you is great. I've always wanted to write a big, juicy, multi-generational novel that had secrets and lies and, overlapping plots in the spirit of Isabel Allende or Virginia Woolf's The Years, or, of course, the Forsyte Saga. But I knew that if I ever got to do that, what I wanted to do was try and approximate what the British playwright Tom Stoppard had done in his play Arcadia. And if any of you have seen Arcadia, you know that this is a play that tells the story of one family, a single family, and moves back and forth in time from something going on in 1816 and the present. And it flips scene to scene, past, present, but it takes place all in one room in the family's house. So it's moving, but it's staying still. The place is what holds the memory. The place is what keeps the family and keeps you constant. And I wanted to try and do that because, as far as I can tell, that's the best way that I think you can represent history. Not as something that starts in one place and goes forward, but history that goes in layers. The past and present always going one on top of each other. And so that, especially the pathos of history, where the past doesn't know what's coming and the present doesn't know what's past. Especially family histories, where we are constantly, it seems, echoing and repeating our parents and grandparents without knowing that we're doing it, often because we don't know fully who they are. So I wanted to see if I could actually write a novel that did something like that. Meanwhile, I'm finishing The Postmistress. It's 2008, and Obama is running for president. And I don't know if you remember, but it's sort of early in the spring of '08, he gave a speech in Philadelphia in which he directly quoted Faulkner and explicitly calling our attention to the fact that race was going to be on the surface of the country's conversation with his candidacy. Come in and sit. And he quoted Faulkner, and just so you remember, the lines, "The past isn't dead in this country. It isn't even past." And the way in which he invoked Faulkner to bring our attention to the explicit connection between past and present and his race came to me as a kind of call to arms and an inspiration to break the silence I'd grown up in around race and class. And I knew that whatever it is, that if I did start to write this novel, I wanted it to enter this conversation. I wanted it somehow to ask, what is it about this country that keeps the past present? How is it that the past is never past? So that's, as I was starting to percolate, I handed in the novel, I realized that in many ways the direction for the answer to that question had always been just above my head, above my desk, and sort of taped from desk to desk to desk all through my writing life is this scrap of paper from James Baldwin, and it's one of the epigraphs in the book, and it is his line, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, what if I tried to write a novel that took that literally, that looked at the way in which history is inside us? And how would that be begging the question, which history? Whose history? What is it that's in us? So I thought to myself that writing a family novel, especially the way that the sort of half-truths of family memory gets passed down half-told, creating family myth, might be a really good way to start to think about keeping the past present and how we build Baldwin's trap, the walls of Baldwin's trap. So that is what I started to, that was the soup I started to stir, that sense of secrets and silence, histories inside us, and the structures of past and present. And especially, I was ready to think about my own family and its position in that trap of history. How was it carrying forward the country's history, unknowing the way that families do? My family is white, WASP, and moneyed, old moneyed. So I wanted to think about what does a history look like? What is my family? What history is my family carrying inside? And what would a novel look like that told that history over time? So the guest book is a novel, a multi-generational novel about an old money family that's run out of its money, but not its place, which is an island off the coast of Maine, or more importantly, the sense of its place in the world. It moves back and forth in time from a story in the 1930s, 1935, 36, the 50s, 1959, and the present. And but always alternating between this island and the island of Manhattan. So what I'm going to read tonight is, it comes towards the end of the book, and I'm going to center on the family in the 50s, so 1959. Kitty and Ogden Milton, who are the patriarchs, they've bought this island in 36, are throwing an engagement party for their youngest daughter, Evelyn, and her fiancé, Dickie Pratt. And so you're going to hear the sort of scene where the party is getting into full swing. And you should know that Kitty and Ogden have 3 children. There's Evelyn, who's getting married. There's Joan, who's an elder daughter, and there is Moss, their son. And Moss aspires to be a musician, but knowing that he is destined for his father's investment bank in the fall. So this is very much his last, as he sees it, his last summer. All these children are in their 20s and late 20s. Into this party has arrived 2 unexpected guests, and they appear on the island uninvited, but they are not unknown. Len Levy is the second Jewish man to be hired by Ogden Milton in the White Shoe investment banking firm that he runs. And he is secretly carrying on with Joan, the older daughter. His best friend, Reg Pauling, is an African-American writer who's just come back from Europe, where he's been reporting on the Marshall Plan's effects in Europe. And he and Moss have become quite close over the course of the summer, as they have met just by accident in the village, in Greenwich Village. So all of that precedes this moment. The boats rounded the point and came toward them, one after another in the slanting light, the figures standing along the gunwales, bursting into motion as they neared. "Hello, hello," they called over the diminishing distance. "Hello." "They're here." Evelyn ran down the lawn, a brilliant shock of blue, Joan and Anne following. And how Joan loved these first moments when anything at all might happen. The night ahead and the sun just beginning to sink into the hills, the island growing dark behind her. "Tie up here," she said to the Fessendens, who just maneuvered neatly in alongside the boats, tied stern to stern, 4 boats deep from the dock. They had brought a cousin from the south, possessed of a moist beauty, her pale gaze framed loosely by hair, light as wheat, her eyes perpetually wide as if she'd just been goosed. One felt she might wrap around the first upright man she met and never loosen her hold, Joan reflected, smiling at her. "Hello. I've never had such a bumpety ride. Cousin Franny lifted herself from the bench in the cockpit and climbed out of the boat. Joan caught Moss's eye, but he was the height of good manners, helping the girl over the gunwale and onto the dock beside him. "I hope there's lots and lots of bad behavior," she whispered to him as she turned to walk up the gangway. He nodded solemnly and winked at Joan. Peggy, Babs, and Otsie Matthews sat in the bow of their father, Cy Matthews' boat. He had a dirty, irreverent mouth, which her father suffered, Joan knew, because he was an expert around boats and had proven himself useful during the banking crisis of '32, having shown a surprisingly astute grip on when the financial winds would shift long before others. He cut a wide swath around the gam and backed into the last open spot on the dock. "My getaway," he smiled conspiratorially and handed Joan the painter. "You look lovely, dear." Teeny and Bing Lamont were right behind him with their son and new daughter-in-law, née a Ludlow of New York. Blonde and sleek and high-boned, she stepped onto the dock with the bowline in her hand. Where she walked, one imagined carpets unrolling before her, cloaks of ermine swirling around booted legs, swords and lashes, hounds. Having modeled for Vogue, she qualified as an out-and-out glamour girl, though she had first been born and bred a Brearley girl, so she was keen-minded, too. Her name was Constance. It was generally agreed that of the eligible possibilities, really only Elliot Lamont could have wed her. Joan had heard that Elliot had sat next to her on a transcontinental flight, and as can happen between a very attractive woman and an equally attractive young man, they fell into conversation, and a good one. He asked her how she came to be a model. When was it she first knew that's what she wanted to do? And then, somewhere over the middle of the country, he said, "Listen, what do you think about standing there waiting for the cameras to click?" She had turned her lovely eyes and regarded him a minute. Tick, tock. And the fact that he had asked her, and the fact that she had answered, and then the final fact that he had known enough to understand the brilliance of that reply, had won him Constance Ludlow. "Well, hello!" Kitty cried, as Rhinelanders, Cabots, and Lowells streamed out of the boathouse. It seemed all of North Haven had arrived in one boat. Kitty kissed them, and Ogden laughed and led everyone down the path toward the picnic grounds, where the fires had been started, and the corn, soaked for the afternoon in its saltwater pool, lay in husks around the embers. 10 pots full of water had been set to boil on the metal grills laid across the stones of the fire pits, where the fires had burned furiously upward and had now settled into manageable coals. Ogden loved the challenge set by the ridiculous odds of boiling 60-odd lobsters for a waiting party. The kettles would take the better part of an hour to come to a boil, and then, keeping them boiling, Ogden instructed, would take a man at each pit. Reg and Len had volunteered for the job and stood a little to the side of the party as Dickie went round with bottles and a stack of paper cups, like the Pied Piper of gin. Evelyn and Joan were passing plates of cheese and chutney on Ritz crackers, and Moss seemed to be everywhere, shaking hands, earnest and warm in a Madras jacket and Bermuda shorts, welcoming everyone in, a great smile on his face as he surveyed the shifting tide of people around him. The Fillmore Baker Juniors arrived with Granny Baker in tow, one of the first to forgo the warmer waters of Long Island Sound, and organized Fillmore Senior to come up and build an enormous, exuberant folly on the thoroughfare. Behind them trooped the Cheevers, distant cousins of the Trumbulls, the Wright Cheevers, no relation to that author. "God, what a crush of people," Mrs. Cheever drawled, kissing Ogden, and stalled at the edge. "Are they all our sort?" She winked. "Of course." He took her elbow and guided her into the clump around Kitty. "Hello!" they cried. "Hello!" A group had taken their drinks and wandered down the paths that stretched away from this spot, farther into the island. Through the trees, the blues and yellows, the linens and silks shimmered as they walked away. The lobster car had been filled with beers and moored to the rock at the end of the ledge, where it bobbed, cold. Len watched Kitty pull free of the group of women around her and cross over to find Dickie with his bottle. And even here, even in the midst of a crowd, Len saw, what Kitty did drew her husband's gaze, as though she were the point of Ogden's perspective, the vanishing point. He flushed and poked at the fire, and then quickly looked up and searched for Joan. She was moving easily through the clumps of guests, chatting, her sister beside her, the contrast between them plain. Len found himself relishing the difference. Unlike her sister, Joan's flame was banked but glowing all the same. There was the earnest, truthful faith inside her, a charity of soul. Though she seemed smaller to him here, the place defined her, the rituals, the small devotions, tending it, mending it, defined all of them, he thought. Fine for the academics and poets, men who stayed in one place and spent their lives thinking, tinkering. Fine for Ogden Milton, in whose image the place was. But no good for him. Len caught sight of Joan's face in profile, nodding to a woman in a blue cardigan, that little smile upon her lips that was always on her lips. His chest expanded. He wanted to show her how small this place was, how big she could be, they could be, together. He wanted to tell her all of it, all in a rush. He looked up and saw Reg, standing by his own pit, staring back at him, a bottle of beer in his hand and a peculiar expression on his face. Reg looked at Len, then down again at the fire. Len wandered over. "What are you doing?" "What do you think?" Reg answered, so quietly Len had to lean toward him. Reg turned and looked him in the eye. "I know you," Len said. "You're about to do something." Reg shook his head. The two turned back to the party. Dickie Pratt was still wandering around with the gin, and Len held up his cup to be filled. Dickie halted, and for a second it looked to Reg like he'd refuse. But he poured, and then with the other hand splashed the tonic into the cup. "Listen," he stalled in front of them a minute, looking from one to the other. He was flushed. "I want to make something clear, something from earlier." Reg drank, his eyes on him. "Let's get it straight. I don't dislike the Jews." Len looked wordlessly back at him. "You and I work together," Dickie protested, "and I've got a lot of Jewish friends." Len nodded and looked out into the party. Know what Otto Kahn said? "A kike is a Jewish gentleman who has just left the room." Dickie stiffened. "Dickie?" Evelyn had appeared at his side, her eyes on Reg. "We need the gin." And she pulled at her fiancé, who remained where he stood, speechless. "Come on," she said. But Dickie stood there, shaking his head, looking from Len to Reg. "What the hell?" "Dickie, what have you two got to be so angry about?" he burst out. "You're at Milton Higginson, Levy, and you," he stared at Reg, "you went to Harvard. You should be on our side. You should be part of the solution." "The solution," Reg whistled. "First or final?" "Reg," Len inhaled. "Oh, come off it," Dickie frowned. "You're at our party." "That's right," Reg stared back. "Reg," Len said again. "I have nothing to be ashamed of." Dickie wagged his finger. "Nothing at all." He put his arm around Evelyn and steered her off. "Jesus," Len exhaled. "There," Reg said. "You heard it." Len drank. "Dickie is an anomaly." "Man alive, listen to you. It can't hold." "Why not?" Len asked. Reg didn't answer. Len glanced at him. Reg bent and grabbed a stick off the woodpile and slid it in under the grates. "You know it can't," Reg frowned. "You know it, Len. A little while ago, you'd have been the first to point that out." Len's jaw tightened. "None of them matter, Reg. Don't you see? It's just padding around in the dark, hitting wildly. They're silly. All of this," he took in the horseshoes, the genial Malay, "doesn't matter." "Since when?" Reg asked. Len shrugged. "You're bewitched." Reg said. What if I am? You don't want all this, Len. No, Len agreed. I want her. Reg looked at Len, then down at his feet, the rip that had started in his heart tearing further, the great dumb ox that was his friend, the believer, the rip between them tearing wide. He kicked at the fire. Let's get out of here. We can't leave. You know we can't. Why not? Look, you know why not as well as I do. I want to hear what you say, Reg answered. Screw you, Reg. Don't be a son of a bitch. Reg hugged his cup to his chest. They talk a good game, but it won't matter. She's not one of them. Reg shook his head. She's just the same. Watch her. I am, Len said quietly. I watch her all the time. A spark popped out of the fire onto the dry grass. Reg stamped it out. You're wrong, said Len. You think you're right, but you're wrong. He went to find another beer. In that moment, Reg wanted to be rid of all of them, even Len, rid of their promises and their hopes and the hand that extended but did not include. And he stood there by the fire, seeing Len's shoulders move through the group, profoundly, intensely, alone. At last, the lobsters were pulled from the pots and set on platters, and the girls brought melted butter in bowls down from the big house. Hot corn was tossed in baskets, and "It's time," called Ogden. "Come on," Kitty urged. "Come get a lobster and take a seat at the table." The enormous single table was made up of 5 barn doors set on trestles and benches Ogden had had the Rhinelanders man bang together for the feast. Down the center were the vases filled by Kitty with marguerites and rose hips, and carrying the charm of a summer house out here into the open evening. And the sun began dropping into the sea. People came to the Miltons, thought Sally Lowell, and came away more at ease with things, in love a little more. She turned her brown eyes to her own husband, sitting on the other side of that remarkable Mr. Pauling. She couldn't catch what they were talking about, though by the intent look on each of their faces, she was certain it might be political. She was tired of politics. Her eyes roamed over the group again. The Miltons had the knack for throwing a party. Kitty made a man feel proud, and a woman understood. Ogden showed you how lucky you were, damn lucky to be alive. Sally put the emphasis where her father always had, cheerfully profane, damn fine, damn lucky, damn hard. He had died years ago, and she still missed him. The party swelled around her. Wasn't this what it all was for? So Roger Pratt believed, sitting at the opposite corner of the vast table, getting quietly smashed. Isn't this what it was all for? Groton, St. Paul's, Farmington, all of them had been sown and seeded in the same ground, and here were the blooms, the heads nodding, the laughter and the bright eyes. Nothing was wrong with being like-minded. Everyone here could be trusted to behave as they had been raised, to be good, to be kind, to think of others. And because you expected to be met with what you gave, those qualities grew. His eye caught on the Jew pushing back from the other end of the table with a glass in his hand, and considered him. Maybe he was a good sort, but this was the trouble. One couldn't count on it. One couldn't count on a man like that to do the same as they all did. They agreed on decorum, an ethos, damn it, the right point of view. One couldn't rely on him to behave as he ought, or even as was expected. One couldn't prepare. The party loosened after the lobster, and the candles were lit. "Aldo," Kitty called down the table to Mr. Weld, "let's have a song." "What'll you have?" "I'll be ready when you are," she sang and trailed off, looking at him. "Right you are. Come on, man," Aldo called. "Singers, up on your feet." Men of different ages pulled themselves up from the table, called to the shoe that was forming in front of the fires. Mr. Weld had been the pitch pipe of the Whiffenpoofs at Yale, and he hummed the first note of the song to get it in his head, then walked round to the men gathered behind him. Dickie stood beside his father, and Ogden and Moss joined them, and on Moss's other side stood Fenno. There was Elliot Lamont and Cy Matthews and the youngest Rhinelander boy who'd sung at Harvard and was a scamp, but who nonetheless was going to try his hand at politics. He had always had the voice of an angel. The rest of the party stilled and turned toward the shoe. Joan found herself on one of the benches beside her mother. She had lost sight of Len in the crowd. The men in the shoe drew close and tipped toward one another, waiting for Aldo Weld to start them off, their eyes on him. He raised his hand and opened his mouth, and in a light, irrepressible tenor, he led the men forward into the song. I'll be ready when you are. And Ogden, Fenno, Dickie, Moss, and Elliot went right along beside him, sending the notes of the song into the air. You can count on me as ready to go. And then Moss stepped forward out of the shoe and toward the guests, swinging into the solo with the light step of a dancer, the words less the enticement than the way the tune climbed up the scale and swung out over the second line. Alone, he sang the notes the men behind him held, sang with a sweet longing, the men behind him growing softer, letting Moss soar so everyone could hear, there on the rocks, Moss's single treble raised to the sky. He was so good, his voice rich and sweet and light, all light. Reg watched the glow on Moss's face as he sang. How music filled him. How Moss believed with all the breath in him in every note he sang, note by note, as if the world could be built on air and sound. As if the problems of the world might be solved by men like these, ranged in a tight circle, leaning into the notes sung together, swelling upward into a twilit sky. He knew that this was Moss's dream. And he remembered that night long ago at Harvard when he'd stumbled on Moss singing just such a song, sending note after note into the air, and believing that was enough. And yet, Reg's life, Reg's parents' life, were nowhere in those notes, not even buried. Here on this island in the middle of the Atlantic, he was surrounded by the best and the brightest, the men who ran and who would run this country and who would never lay a hand on him, but who could change the laws if they could see. And they wouldn't. Reg saw the limit fully in this singing. Moss sang as if the gates of the world could open with him, believing with all his heart that they could. But here on the island, the care with which Reg was being handled, the pronounced attention, was merely the opposite face of the face that gave the hard stare, or the push between the ribs, or the whip. Both faces turned to the black man as though to a wall that had to be climbed or knocked down, and always with the infinitesimal moment of wariness that slid immediately into anger or polite regard, as if to say, "Oh, you again." This was what he wanted to rip into. This was why Reg thought he'd come, why he'd made this trip over to the island in a lobster boat, in part for this, to hear what always went unvoiced and to make Moss see that, to make Moss see. But watching Moss sing, the vast uselessness of what he was after caught Reg there around the fire. Seeing was not enough. Speaking was not enough. Doing even was not enough. He could tear it down for Moss, and for Len, he thought as Len moved beside him. And there'd be satisfaction in it, but little joy. Joy. The word floated up, and Mrs. Milton caught his eye. He held her gaze a moment, and then she nodded at him and looked away. He shuddered. She was, perhaps, the worst of them all. "I'm ready to go," finished Moss, stepping back in the shoe. So I'm absolutely happy to take any questions or any comments that you have right here. Yes.
I'm wondering if anyone in your family recognized themselves in the novel.
Did anybody in my family recognize themselves in the novel? May I say that there was a parlor game being played all of this spring because they read an early draft. We're like, I think I'm like parts of moss mixed with whatever. There was a lot of amalgam making, but the Miltons are of my family, but these characters are so not my family, and yet it's interesting to hear how everyone sees, or certainly my cousins see themselves, here and there. And the thing that is probably the most truthful is the place. The island is, our family does have a place like this, and a multi-generational place. I mean, I grew up with many, many generations in my head. But that landscape is what's generated all three of my novels and my poetry. So that's what anchors, these people, these made-up people. Yeah.
There's a character, or there's the younger generation, the scholar, has this anchoress.
Mm.
And I'm kind of interested in that whole concept of the anchoress and you working it into this novel. And does it have a meaning? I was wondering what it means in relation to the family, if there's a meaning or if it was just something that you were fascinated with and wanted her to be.
My little sidebar obsession. So the question is the anchoress, that Evie Milton, who's the third generation, the present generation, is a feminist medieval historian. She's a professor at NYU. And her sort of claim to fame was rereading The Power of Silence. She came into academic life in the 80s. That was very much the vogue. But the anchoress, which is, those of you who know of them will remember, they were girls who were shut up in the side of abbeys or monasteries, and they served to be the kind of soul of an institution, and they were bricked in for the rest of their lives. They lived in silence. They had a window that faced into the church, and one window that faced out into the world. And so it was, once I heard about anchoresses, I was just so gobsmacked by that I just thought that was such a great image of the way in which women can be the kind of foundation of a structure that in fact silences them, and that the power that they have in being in that room is ambivalent at best. In fact, Evie, very early you meet her in the novel, and she's thinking about the anchoresses and thinking about how now she would, at the time she thought it was again this sort of metaphor for power and silence, and she's like, now really it's just a woman who's shut up in a room, and she thinks to herself, metaphor is for the young, because the sort of older she's gotten, the more she's understood the dangers of silence. And in many ways this book, if you've read it, you know that one of the sort of phrases that gets repeated over and over is, some things are better left off unsaid. And that's very much Kitty's ethos. That's very much the way that the family moves. And so I wanted to think about all the varieties of silence, and as family silences, cultural silences. But then, so the anchoress, the first section of the book, which is about the 30s, is called The Anchoress. So, but also it's like so cool, that that image. Okay, thank you so much for being here. And I'm happy to sign books and talk otherwise.